Now it's time to add certain numbers, certain calculations, and certain topics. I took the time to include over here certain calculations that you need to know so far. So, from the previous video, you learned how to calculate the pulse pressure, and the pulse pressure is calculated by the systolic pressure minus or subtracting the diastolic pressure. With this pulse pressure, you are able to calculate the mean arterial pressure of the person. If you have any number, like could be, not necessarily have to be 120 over 80, could be 110 over 70, or could be let's see, 130 over 80, any kind of the two numbers, systolic and diastolic, you are able to calculate the pulse pressure and you are able to calculate the mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure is calculated, remember, you have to calculate what is inside of the bracket first, means pulse pressure divided 3, and to this number you have to add the diastolic. But we can also calculate the maximum heart rate, because the next topic, or the topic that I try to explain, is how our physiology change when we engage in physical exercise. And certainly when we engage in physical exercise, we develop what is called the maximum heart rate. So we have basically two heart rates. The one that we produce when we are in resting condition, the one that I develop right here in front of the camera, or meanwhile you are studying or watching TV, is considered the resting heart rate. But we also can develop a heart rate when we are in exercise. And certainly is not increased forever, regardless if you are a trained athlete or if you're not. We have also a maximum heart rate. And the maximum heart rate is calculated by this magic number, 220 minus the patient age. So simple, how to calculate pulse pressure, mean arterial pressure, maximum heart rate. Now, what is important is that calculation, that is the cardiac output. That the cardiac output is calculated by the stroke volume times the heart rate. We mentioned what is the meaning of cardiac output. That is the maximum amount or is the volume of blood that is ejected from the ventricles during systole per minute. And the stroke volume is very similar. It's different time frame, because the stroke volume is defined as the volume of blood that is ejected by the ventricles by beat, not by minute, by beat. Now, we need to consider average numbers in resting conditions. Now, the average number for heart rate in resting condition, remember the heart rate goes between 60 to 100. So in an adult person, the average in resting position is considered 72 beats per minute. We also have the stroke volume that is average. And the average in stroke volume is considered 70 milliliters per beat. And the cardiac output, based on this calculation, is average 5,000 milliliters per minute. Keep in mind this number, because that one is the goal of the heart, to produce that cardiac output per minute in order to keep the normal blood pressure and normal irrigation in our body. This one is the goal, 5,000 milliliters per minute. 5,000 milliliters per minute represent 5 liters per minute and represent 10 liters of the the little water bottles, the half a liter of the water bottles, the plastic water bottles, represent 500 milliliters. So when you count 10 bottles of those, represent one cardiac output average in an adult. You also have to consider that the cardiac output, the stroke volume, this stroke volume is affected by other values, and this stroke volume is affected by the peripheral resistance that we mentioned before, the contractility or strength of contraction, and the end of the diastolic volume. Let me explain briefly about those. The peripheral resistance we mentioned before, right? So the peripheral resistance in this aorta or pulmonary artery increase for any reason. If that two arteries increase the peripheral resistance, means they are stiffer. What does it mean is the amount of blood in the ventricle when they systole, they cannot eject that ideal 70 milliliters per beat because there is a resistance in the peripheral resistance of the aorta and pulmonary artery. In other words, if the peripheral resistance increase, the stroke volume decrease. And if the stroke volume decrease, increase the end of diastolic volume. End of diastolic volume is defined as the amount of blood that is kept in the two ventricles before the two ventricles systole. Is at the end of diastole. Now, keep in mind, if the peripheral resistance increase, the stroke volume decrease because it's not possible to eject that 60% of blood from the ventricles, ideally, into the aorta or pulmonary artery. And if that one happens, that end of diastolic volume increase because it's accumulated over there. We cannot eject the 60% of volume after the end of diastolic volume. We cannot eject the 60%. So certain amount remain and another amount of blood is getting into the ventricle. So the end of diastolic volume increase. Now, contractility is related to the Starling law forces. Means that if the end of diastolic volume increase, the contractility or strength of contraction have to increase in order to produce the same or ideal stroke volume. So these factors are the ones that are essential to play with. But I would be concentrated in these factors over here. And I wrote up there two concepts for you to understand. One, because everything is related what is happening in our physiology, cardiovascular physiology, if we engage in physical exercise. And there is one topic called aerobic capacity of the patient. What is the aerobic capacity of the patient? And it's also defined as the maximum oxygen uptake. It can be understood in different ways, but basically the aerobic capacity is the oxygen consumption during exercise. And it's also called aerobic because it refers to oxygen. So meanwhile we have oxygen supply, we can produce aerobic respiration in the cells and the amount of ATP needed for that physical exercise. This aerobic capacity or maximum oxygen uptake is reached when an average person is reaching between 50 to 70% of the exercise. but it's also related with your training. If you are a trained person or an athlete, and I'm not talking about going to Zumba class 3 times a week, I'm talking about to seriously train 3 or 4 times a week for minimum 2 or 3 hours each one. So that person has a heart, the lungs and the heart that are adjusted for that physical exercise, that is not developed in overnight. It's developed through a really reasonable period of time, and sometimes it's years. But certainly the aerobic capacity of an athlete is higher than the aerobic capacity of the person that is not trained. And it's important because aerobic capacity and lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold are very connected. Because the definition of lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold is defined as the maximum amount of aerobic exercise a person can develop, after which lactate threshold is accumulated in the tissue. In other words, if I'm going to start riding on bicycle, obviously I'm not a trained person, but I'm going to start riding on bicycle. Everybody, all human beings in Earth, they have a threshold. They have a lactate threshold. The difference between me and an athlete, both are going to ride on bicycle. Both are going to live from the same point. And which one is the target? Point is that I'm going to ride on bicycle. I'm not an athlete, obviously. I'm going to ride on bicycle, and after a certain period of time, so during all this time, and obviously all of us, the athlete and me, we are going to warm up. Why we need to warm up? To increase the heart rate, to increase the blood flow, and to increase the oxygen uptake. Now, with this condition that we already warm up, we are going to launch. Okay, take off. After a period of time that I'm riding on bicycle, and supposedly it's gonna be not just watching the flowers or very slow, it's gonna be with a certain effective physical exercise. And at a certain point, I feel short in breath. I feel tired, especially in my legs. And I feel that my breath, I have to make it deeper, right? Stronger, like, so if at the beginning I have the rhythm between the exercise and the breathing rate, after a while, the breathing rate has to be faster in order to supply more oxygen. And that one is when I reach my lactate threshold. Well, does it mean that I exhaust my aerobic capacity? I produce my 70% of physical exercise, that I consume all the oxygen in my system to produce a skeletal muscle contraction. When this one happens, my cells cannot produce more aerobic respiration or ATP by this aerobic respiration. In other words, if from that point on I continue producing physical exercise, have to be by glycolysis. There is no other way, because I consume all the oxygen in that period of time. I don't have more oxygen supply, and that cells need to produce ATP by glycolysis. And obviously the amount of glycolysis that I can produce by one glucose molecule is only 2 ATP and 2 pyruvic acid. Now, what happened with those pyruvic acid that doesn't have oxygen supply? Without oxygen supply, the pyruvic acid cannot jump into the mitochondria. And without jumping into the mitochondria, the pyruvic acid is turning into lactic acid or lactate. That accumulation of acid is accumulation in the skeletal muscles that are involved in that physical exercise. If I'm talking about riding on bicycle, obviously it's gonna be in my legs. And it takes a while to be removed. That's why oxygen uptake, maximum oxygen uptake, aerobic capacity, and lactate threshold are very related. So in other words, if I consume all the aerobic capacity and consume all the maximum oxygen uptake, there is no way that I cannot accumulate lactate acid. Now, remember, definition of lactate threshold is the maximum amount of aerobic exercise I can produce, after which lactate threshold is accumulated in the skeletal muscles. And I took the time to present two different scenarios if the person engaged in exercising or the person engaged in is in resting position. And I want to start in this one because I want you to be clear how stable the cardiac output have to be during resting condition, regardless if you are an athlete or if you are a person without training. And I took the time to present over here two scenarios, the athlete and myself. And obviously I'm not 40 years old, but let's pretend I am, just to make the numbers. And yes, the athlete and me, both, we have 40 years old. And if we both have 40 years old, the athlete heart rate is never a normal heart rate. The athlete heart rate is always below 60 because that individual and is related with the contractility. Stroke volume is affected by contractility. What happens? If you are an athlete, you have your heart muscles, your myocardium, way stronger than my myocardium. And because of that, in any systole, in any contraction of the ventricles, you are able to eject way more amount of blood. Your stroke volume, if you are an athlete, is higher. And remember, that one is where it's coming from. If the stroke volume is higher, we need to reduce the heart rate in order to produce the normal cardiac output, that is 5,000 milliliters per minute. Let me explain over here. So both athlete and me are 40 years old. The heart rate for the athlete is never, ever a normal heart rate. This athlete remains in normal bradycardia in resting position. And we figured it out, that one is one sample, that is around 33 beats per minute. And Dr. Ferrari's heart rate is the average that we have over here. The heart rate, 72 beats per minute. Now, because the stroke volume, so this one is an athlete, heart rate 33, stroke volume 151, and if you multiply by to the other one, ideally have to be 5,000 milliliters per minute. And same scenario for me, because during resting position, my cardiac output or the athlete cardiac output should be pretty much the same. Because in that way, our physiology is imbalanced. Our cardiovascular physiology is imbalanced. The cardiac output in resting conditions is average 5,000 milliliters per minute. Now, let's pretend that both the athlete or mine engage in physical exercise. And if we engage in physical exercise, obviously it have to be the same physical exercise. Like I mentioned before, we are going to make a race in bicycle, right? So obviously, before to jump over here, I forgot to mention something about the lactate threshold. If the patient is an athlete, do you think that the patient will reach that lactate threshold faster than me or later than me? Obviously, it's way later than me. I will reach my lactate threshold way faster. Or in other words, is my lactate threshold is lower than the athlete, or the athlete lactate threshold is way higher than myself. This one is something that gives you an idea that the lactate threshold is reached for an athlete as well. But the athlete need to compete way longer period of time before they reach the threshold. But again, we both engage in physical exercise, we both are 40 years old, and the athlete maximum heart rate is based on this calculation. It's calculated by 220 minus the age. And obviously the athlete and myself, we are both the same age, both have the same maximum heart rate, that is 180 beats per minute. Now, let's apply, and I make the calculation over here for the stroke volume. The stroke volume for the athlete, remember that the stroke volume for the athlete have to be obviously higher, and it's calculated because when you have two of the three numbers over here, you have to be able to calculate the third value. In other words, if you have cardiac output and heart rate, you can calculate the stroke volume. If you have a stroke volume and cardiac output, you can calculate heart rate. Any kind of combination. If you have two of the three, you are able to calculate the third one. And this one is the scenario, because in that stroke volume for the athlete, you make number one over here. The stroke volume is calculated by cardiac output divided the heart rate. And the cardiac output average is 5,000 and the heart rate is 33. So the stroke volume for this athlete in exercising is 151 milliliters per beat. And it's exactly the same one over here. So pay attention that during exercise, the stroke volume doesn't change much. In fact, doesn't change really significantly, not for an athlete, not for a normal person. What we adjust most of the time in order to increase the heart rate is, in order to increase the cardiac output, is the heart rate. Now, and this one is the stroke volume. However, now we have to calculate the cardiac output for this athlete. And cardiac output, make the calculation. That is heart rate multiplied stroke volume. 180 times 151 is 27,000 milliliters per minute. So from the resting, that is 5,000, that athlete during exercise can reach up to 27,000 plus, 27,000 milliliters per minute. What happened with Dr. Ferraris, that was 4 years old? The maximum heart rate is the same one because it's 4 years old. 220 minus 40 is 180. Now, what happened with my stroke volume? My stroke volume during exercise doesn't change much. That's why we use the average over here. Now, if we apply the calculation, the same calculation for Dr. Ferraris, we'll have the cardiac output that is 70 times 180 and come out with 12,060 milliliters per minute. And this one is the way how to exercise this concept. Now, you will have different exercises, and if there are different scenarios that you have to calculate, either one of the two, or the stroke volume, or the cardiac output, or the heart rate, or the maximum heart rate, or the mean arterial pressure, or the pulse pressure, any of those. And keep in mind during the test that if I mention that that person cardiac output increase to that one, or that person is exercising during exercising, and you have to calculate one of the values, you have to use the maximum heart rate because the patient is exercising. If the patient is in resting conditions, it's different. And I'm going to email you different samples that you can figure it out. But certainly, if I mention that the stroke volume increase, well, you have to use that number that I give you in the exercise. But certainly, there are several types of calculations for this topic. And I think you have to reinforce all these concepts with the lab book and with the textbook. And if you have any further questions, you can always reach me.